just relatively a few of us, I won't say too much of an entree other than to say thank everybody for coming in and signing up for Philip's talk. It is something which, for obvious reasons, we can't meet up at the moment, and we don't really know when we will be able to do that. So what we've put in place, and we've got a framework, is to have these talks every 2 weeks, and we've got a schedule, I think, penned out until the end of September, which I think will probably, by then, or getting close to them, we should know how things are developing and whether we can start having any face-to-face meetings. But it's very uncertain at the moment. We'll just have to play things by ear. But
Suzette is in.
Let me. So we've got, oh well, excellent. Suzette's joined us. Good evening,
Hello.
Suzette.
Finally,
Good evening.
finally, hello.
You're very welcome. Did you
Hi,
do anything?
Suzette. Hi.
Hello. Let me get the participants on board. Thank you.
No,
finally got in.
I'm glad you're in. I was just welcoming everybody for coming in, Suzette. You came in spot on time. But I was just about to introduce Philip, who's our speaker this evening. And I'll just do a very brief introduction. Philip is a British-born freelance writer and photographer who moved to Thailand over 25 years ago. He actually moved there in 1994. And he has a very strong focus on both Thailand and Southeast Asia. With his latest book, the theme of which is being used for this evening's talk is very Bangkok in the city of the senses, and we'll be focusing very much on that. And that was a sequel to his previous book, Very Thai, Everyday Popular Culture, which I'm quoting now, proved to be an iconic bestseller, and hopefully your new book, your latest book, Philip, will follow suit. So I look forward to hearing more about that. But previously, Philip was the founding editor of the Thai capital, First City Listings, Bangkok Metro, which he explained he took down that role 4 days after arriving in Bangkok, which is very impressive in itself, and also for the Time Out Bangkok City Guide. And he's also a very accredited photographer, and he's staged a number of successful photograph exhibitions in Chiang Mai and Bangkok, and probably in a number of other Thai cities. And we're very fortunate for us that Philip's currently back in the UK, or back in England. Some of you will have heard he's here because he's been stranded here because of the coronavirus pandemic, which means he can't get back to Thailand. But he is looking after his elderly parents, and there has been a lot of goods come out of it. But obviously, he'll want to be getting back sooner rather than later when he can, which that's a bit uncertain as it stands. But I think that's all really I want to say. Welcome, everybody. Brief introduction to Philip, and now pass over to Philip so he can run through and explain how he's going to give his presentation. Philip, I'll pass the screen over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everyone else, for coming along today. This is the second video interview I've been doing since this pandemic. It seems to be a new kind of approach. I seem to get more invitations to go online than to be in print these days. So it's a big sign of the times of how things are changing. So what we've worked out as the best way to handle this is to show my presentation of slides, which I'd normally give in a spoken talk in an auditorium. And through that process, you will all be muted. It's really just so that there's not the noise of interruptions and notifications on computers and things like that. And then when I've got to the end of the slides, which will take approximately half an hour, then I'll come back visible again, and it'll be open to questions and answers. And through that process, I understand if it's working correctly, you'll see a little screen of me speaking, which I think you can make as big or small as you prefer, and move it around the screen. But you'll be seeing the slides that I present normally onto a projection. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Sounds
correct.
good.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I will share the screen now, so you'll start to see the slides, and I'll start to talk. Okay, here goes. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, Charlie, what would be the how would you do that? To speak
I've
to
now
me?
muted everybody just so there's no background noise. But you can raise your hand and you should be able to see it. There is a little button as well for raising your hand, which you can do virtually. So
Okay. All right. Well, here goes.
okay,
I'll try not to take too long. It should be about half an hour.
perfect.
Okay. Okay, there we go. This talk is taking its title from the name of the book, Very Bangkok in the City of the Senses. This came out earlier in the year in Thailand and is now available across the world in these different markets. And so today I'm going to be talking about why I've given it that subtitle, In the City of the Senses. And there's a very specific reason that I've done that. Now, Bangkok is a city with a lot of preconceived ideas. People have very fixed notions about what Bangkok is about. A lot of those are to do with the presentation of Bangkok as the city of smiles, city of angels, very much a genteel way of presenting the city that doesn't always square with how people experience it when they're in the city or with other reputations of the city, particularly the sensational aspect that focuses on the sleazy nightlife and things like this, which is a fairly outdated view of the city. That kind of image is associated with the Bangkok noir genre of novels, which focus on a lot of crime and sleazy aspects of the city's past character. Now, as it happens, there's quite an interest among young designers to present a new image of Bangkok, and some of those are taking up that sensationalist view in new slogans. One of those is I Want a Bangkok, which is a huge promotion all across the city. There's various other ones that also focus on this more rival view of the city. But there's another slogan which I think is the most representative of all of the slogans about the city, City of Life. That is the BMA's presentation of the city. And it really does sum up how I and many others experience this city. Now, I came here in 1994, and as was mentioned earlier, I was hired just 4 days into being in the city to be editor of its first city listings magazine, which was called Metro. And it was the first time that any publication had resorted the city into categories as a kind of, it was by types of entertainments and so forth, how people experience it. So whether it's nightlife or entertainments or sports or films, art shows, etc., it was dividing the city up that way. Now, I've also worked on guidebooks, particularly the Time Out series of guidebooks about Bangkok, which look at the city from another viewpoint, which is timeline through history, but also through genres that are associated with what foreigners want to access Bangkok through. So I've been very much involved in shaping Bangkok's presentation to the outside world over 25 years now. And a lot of that is an outsider presentation, outsider categories that were not how people really approached the city 25 years ago. Now, about 15 years ago, I launched the book Very Thai, which took a different kind of angle. It was looking at the city from the popular culture aspect of the everyday things in the street and in daily life that were encountered by people, but which weren't explained to outsiders, and very often not explained within the culture itself to Thai people through the cultural channels. Normally, culture in Thailand is a high culture activity, and it's about things that show face for the country. But the everyday things, which are often quite low status or of aspects of life that are maybe not terribly presentable, but which mean a lot to everyday life, that made the book have a certain appeal, and it became a bit of a cult style guide for a lot of people in the creative world. Now, I followed that up with this book, Very Bangkok, maintaining the brand identity of the series. But this is more specifically about the Bangkokness of Bangkok. Now, when I talked to a lot of Thais about their views of the city, I would keep getting back generic views of Thainess. People would find a resistance to talking about how Bangkok is different to Thailand and how Bangkokness is different to Thainess. It's a very underexplored topic, so I found it was very fruitful to look into these different aspects of the city, because there hasn't really been a big intensive look at the city in print for a very long time. The most recent portrait of the city is a good 15, 20 years old and was very slim and tended to focus on the same kind of places that we see in every book on the city. So this book looks all through the greater metropolitan area, through many different subcultures and suburbs and many different groups that people would not normally find out much about. And the vehicle I use to look at it is the senses. Now, when we're considering exploring anything, everyone is using their senses to do it. So this is a way that people can find accessible, but there are particular approaches to the senses that are found in Bangkok that are not so typical of other major cities. Now, the very strongest first impression that most people have is of scent or smell. I remember asking my cousin what his impression of Bangkok was, and it was that the streets all smelled of food. And that's certainly true. Even after the clearing away of a lot of street food, it hits you in a way that it doesn't in other major cities. And there's a lot of contrast in the way smell approaches our senses in Bangkok. There's an awful lot of pongs and stenches that are very particular to the way that the canals go through the city, the way that water doesn't drain easily from the potholed roads and so forth. But then there's also a cultural value of scent, the way that garlands and flowers are used to emanate the Buddhist Dharma through their olfactory notes of scent in the air, but also there's a broader floral culture and a sense in the food that there's a lot of aromatics used, a lot of very fresh herbs and things like smoke that is used to flavor foods. So there is a real sophistication that that we also find in taste in Bangkok that is slightly different from other places. And this is where I tried to find a difference between Bangkokness and Thainess. I was trying to find out what are the particular flavors relating to Bangkok as opposed to Thai food in general. And it's quite interesting to look at the way that Bangkok food is very heavily influenced by the migrants that have come through there. There's a very heavy Teochew Chinese influence into Bangkok cuisine that is a bit different than what you find in other regions. And so as part of this, rather than look at lists of restaurants or food as a general topic, I tried to identify what the flavor profile of Bangkok is. So following this idea of the senses, it's about what is particular about the place with a lot of innovation happening in the city to heighten a lot of things that are very distinctive there. What you can see in the right-hand picture there is actually a meat cocktail. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's a lab moo cocktail with a strip of bacon on the top. And believe me, it really does taste like lab moo salad. Now, this is a topic that has come into a lot of topicality with the pandemic because we're all not supposed to touch one another at this present time. Now, Bangkok has a very particular touch culture relating to food, to massage, and healing through touch. But it also has a lot of taboos around touch, whereby people have a sense of personal space. They're not physically touching one another in terms of greetings like in other places. So through the senses, you can start to see distinctive things about how the culture is. Now, Bangkok is also a city of a lot of tactile surfaces. Unusual for a world city, it's got an awful lot of handmade objects that are in the public domain. When I go around towns in the UK and other developed cities, you don't see anything like as much handmade objects as you do in Bangkok. It's very much a feature of the city. Now, sound is something that is very dominant in Bangkok. It's an extremely loud city, to the point that a lot of people complain about its noise pollution. And this is a big story in recent years, with the question of sound pollution becoming a public issue. People measure the volumes of it, rather like they measure the air pollution these days. The general public can do this now, and so it's a bit of an issue. But it's also connected to the liveliness of the city, as we see in this tuk-tuk here with huge speakers set in the back of the vehicle. There's also a lot of very particular, more humane sounds connected to Bangkok. Everywhere you go, you find people playing folk instruments all over the city. Here we've got a schoolboy, and he's playing an instrument that is completely handmade. It's somebody's turned a plow into some kind of stringed instrument. And he's playing a form of Isan music as busking. And on the right, we have Brahmins who are blowing conch shell horns in a Brahmin blessing ceremony. So there's a lot more delicate sounds to the culture when we start to look at it through the senses. Now, the most dominant form of sense is actually sight, but I thought I would tweak that a bit and turn that into the word looking, because when we're seeing things, we see with a very particular view. Quite often this is now called the gaze, as in the white male gaze or the imperial gaze. So I'm also looking into what is the Bangkok gaze? What is the way that Bangkok looks at things? How do Bangkokian people approach looks about things? And it's quite interesting to see with devices like selfies. Now there's a lot of big data that means we can analyze this. And it turns out that Bangkok's selfies are very distinctive and different than other places in the world. Bangkok people tend to look at a certain angle. They tend to look a little bit upwards, and in a very passive view, even with the eyes slightly open wider than is the case in other people's selfies around the world. And also when it comes to filters, monochrome filters are extremely unwelcome in things like Instagram, and Thai people tend to boost up the color contrasts and avoid monochromes and subtle colors, and boost up the really bright ones. So how Bangkok people are looking at themselves is with a certain attitude and taste. It even comes down to the aspiration about visual role models. When I arrived in Bangkok, there was a huge fashion to look as Western as possible. This was partly through a lot of advertising of half Western, half Thai people who were the models and the promoters of products and the actors and musicians on TV and in videos and things. But in recent years, it's turned around to being people emulating the plastic surgery version of Koreans through plastic surgery clinics, and the aspiration to look like a modern East Asian, in a kind of a different kind of aspiration than I had seen a couple of decades ago. Now, when it comes to the senses, we tend to think of those first 5 that I've mentioned, but there are in fact about 24 senses that the human beings have, and I've looked at about 20 of them, and some of these are ones that when we reflect on them, are really senses like color. Sight is divided into form and color. And this image here was taken from a Thai designer who had gone around the old town of the city and worked out the dominant colors of different roads and districts in the city. And she did a whole project going into much more detail than this general slide, down to individual streets, which often reflected the trades that were in those particular streets. So there is a sense of color swatches that you can map Bangkok with. Now, somebody has come up with a set of paints based on this concept. It's called Thai Tone, and you can buy these paints that are typical of the color schemes that are in that taste you find all over the city. And here on the right is even some pipes on some shop house have been painted very vividly in a way you find common across the city. But one thing is that about Bangkok is that it has a totally dominant color, which is a bit less dramatic, and that is concrete. It is an extremely concrete city. Now, I'm struck in England how much of a red brick or sometimes yellow brick city it is, perhaps with Portland stone. There are plenty of other cities around the world that are dominated by a particular color of materials that they use. And it has to be said that Bangkok is a concrete-colored city, generally stained with monsoon rains, and increasingly viewed through a veil of air pollution. Now, on the central picture here, you've got an image of the Bangkok Metropolitan Authority combating the smog by spraying water up into the air. And on the right, some graffiti relating to the way Bangkok people were dealing with the smog the past few winters, which has had a benefit in that Bangkok people are very used to wearing masks. So when the COVID pandemic hit, every Bangkokian had masks all ready to go. And that has assuaged some of the problem with the pandemic there. Now, we have receptors in the body to deal with heat and humidity, and certainly it's one of the most dominant things about how Bangkok is sensed by people when they're there. As you can see on the left, even at traffic lights, people don't stop at the lights or the white lines. The motorbikes will stop underneath any shade that's available. Now, one of the senses that we're less familiar on focusing is balance. Now, it happens that Bangkok culture is very balance oriented. We don't tend to think of it in those terms, but whether it's the sport or the dance or martial arts, these are very much balance oriented activities. So looking at something like this gives another lens onto the cultural forms that we might not have thought about in those ways. Now, when it comes to the senses and the city, one of the most crucial is a sense of space. Now, this is something that's very particular in Bangkok, as in there tends not to be very much space. Things are very cramped in. It seems to be by choice because there aren't big plazas. Whenever there is an open space, it's very quickly filled with all kinds of sales and booths and all kinds of activities that bring the areas into very narrow lanes. And a lot of the city is laid out with these shop houses opening out onto the street with very narrow lanes. Through these different images here, you can see from above, there are actually pathways and sois in between those houses in the middle image, but they are so small that look down on from above, you can barely see them. And this is very typical of communities, older dense communities around the city. This particular one is above Klong Toi, and that strange shape in the middle, that's like a chevron, is in fact a football pitch that they didn't have enough space for, so they had to make it in an L shape. And that image won recognition in Time magazine. as a social initiative. But there's also another oddly shaped sports field in Klong Toi. But it does goes to show how little public space there is to do anything, not just parks, but sports areas. On the left is a typical view that we find with all of the superstructures built for highways, bridges, and trains, and they act as a lid on streets. So this is a very particular kind of space that we find in Bangkok that is not typical in many other cities. And on the right, a recent trend has been, instead of actually planting trees, has been to have huge stickers of trees stuck onto buildings and concrete pillars and things like that. Now, when it comes to demarcating space in Bangkok, people use almost anything to hand to demarcate an area for particular reasons. This one possibly is to do with the broken pavement, although I don't know. It may be someone trying to save that space from being used by somebody else, because people use all kinds of ad hoc materials to create parking barriers that are put in public space to reserve them for private use. And there's a lot of contesting of this. So everywhere you go in Bangkok, you see all sorts of things like rubber tires, broken chairs, bungee cords, poles stuck in blocks of concrete within metal tins, things like this, all over the city, being used by people to make the space their own. Now, this is quite an interesting phenomenon. In Bangkok, there's always a problem with making the paving slabs steady. And some wag came along and sprayed a game of minesweeper onto the paving slabs. And the ones that are marked with the bomb, they're the ones that send the black mud up the back of your leg when you step on them. And so this was sent around, people did this around the city a couple of years ago. Now, the city is starting to change its form. All those areas that were made of very dense communities with shop houses, they're now being reshaped in a new kind of space along lines of the mass transit system. And this has become not just a phenomenon that happens without people noticing, is now being noticed very much and marketed along those lines. So we have the SkyTrain being wrapped in an advertisement for a condominium chain called The Line, and it's all about these lines. So the city is physically growing in ways that are very different to how it used to. So that also means transport is having to change, and how motion within the city is, that sense of motion, which is mostly not moving. Here we've got a scene showing how tiresome it can be trying to get around the city. And of course, one of the signature vehicles of Bangkok, the tuk-tuk, frankly, most of the time it spends its time being static, and the drivers are spending their time waiting for rides. But this also gives a view about how a lot of the vehicles that are in the informal transit are handmade. This is just one of many kinds of vehicle that have a very interesting tactile feel, different to other cities. Bangkok also makes a special dispensation for the disabled. This is a new feature that's come in the past year or so, where I think the idea was to prevent street vendors from going on the pavements, and they created these elaborate slalom places for wheelchairs to go through. It does seem to be a bit harsh on the wheelchair users, and as we can see in the back of the picture, hasn't stopped vendors at all. But there are increasing uses of signage to direct people around the city. Because it's a famously wayward and chaotic place, we now see a lot of very clear signage as to where people should go. This was an extraordinary junction in Thonburi, showing how people needed to go around where new pylons were going to go for the SkyTrain. We see a lot of signs telling people where to queue. This never used to be the case in Bangkok, but with the advent of the SkyTrain, there's a lot of instruction about how people should move in the city. And on the right here, people are even being told which direction to walk on bridges and stairs. And there's a bit of a quirk here, because on the roads and in the canals, people are sorry, on the trains and the roads, people go on the left, but in walking and in on the water, people generally pass on the right. I have no idea why that is the case. There's also been a lot of sense of direction with a change in how people are navigating the city. Buses used to be very poorly signed, and that signage has now become a bit of a design project. And so there's a bit of an aesthetic among young people to be urbanists, and there's been all kinds of innovative signage going on in the city in recent years. Now, the sense of direction that we have is also a bit of a cultural window, something that, well, while Bangkok is getting these forms of systemic signage, it's actually got a bit of a penchant for signage that's got an emotional feeling. So we see a lot of these standing policemen around the city. Oh, so was that a wave? Stephen, is that were you? Oh. Okay. So there's a lot of signage that is quite engaging or even quite cute. I've noticed that events that are held within narrow areas of sois, where it's difficult to find your way through because they're basically an old neighborhood, they've been using a kind of signage that marks the path as you go round. So this one festival here used cats with lights behind to be a symbol to follow as you go through the community. Other ones have used illuminated birds that are a kind of plastic illuminated bird. And here this cycling lane has been labeled with love hearts. There's definitely something that's appealing to the people of Bangkok that's a bit different than you'd find, say, in London. Also, the sense of direction is underpinned by a lot of classical beliefs. There's a very strong sense in which the height of something matters hugely, and we can see that in the Tripum cosmology from hundreds of years ago that's depicted on the left of Mount Meru and various oceans and continents, and Watarun being a physical representation of that. But this affects all kinds of behaviors and placing of things in the city. When I was working in publishing, we would have this strange situation where the pictures of any kind of social events, they had to be ordered not according to leading with the best picture, but we had to have the person most senior depicted at the top of the page, and there having to be a hierarchy as you were looking down the page according to social status. So even things like media the design was being influenced by this sense of seniority direction. There are a lot of other subcultures within Bangkok, whether it's Chinese or Muslim. They all have directional impulses that are affecting their cultural forms, particularly feng shui in Chinese culture dictates the shape and direction of a lot of things in Bangkok. And things used to be measured from the center of the traditional city with the city pillar. Now, things like the city pillar are also relating to another sense, which is time. Bangkok has its own time rhythms, which are very distinctive because of the anthems being broadcast at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. With the flags going up and down. And this gives a very distinctive feel that a lot of outsiders notice when they come to the city. Bangkok was also the first place to start doing countdown traffic light signals, which gave a particular kind of feel to rush hour in the city, particularly when you see the lights change and it says something like 156 seconds you've got to wait until the light changes. Now, there's another sense in which time works within Bangkok, and that is the consciousness of there being multiple lives. And this is something that is not part of my own consciousness from before coming to that city. But it definitely is in the mind of people there about reincarnation and the sense of past lives. It's part of the mindset. Now, there's actually a very interesting cafe in Bangkok that has the opportunity for you to lie in a coffin with the lid slid on top of you so that you can sense something about the prospect of death. Pretty much everything in the cafe is themed around death, and even the drinks are rated according to how much closer they bring you to death. So the very high sugar drinks will be rated closer. So I've looked at this topic relating to the sense of human sense of pain, but through the lens of Bangkok's culture, looking at the sense of suffering, because it's very much something that's in the Buddhist culture. And also it's part of the business culture in Bangkok with its huge industry of medical tourism. And here you can see a display of the medical tourism going after its target market. Now, linked with that sense of afterlife is the sixth sense. There is a very strong presence in the city of shrines and all kinds of offerings and various kinds of sixth sense connections, whether it's seeking luck, making offerings to deities, or in this case, contacting them through trance, allowing another being to take over your senses, which is something, again, that's not very commonly found in major cities around the world. But there is a huge subculture relating to trance in Bangkok, and it comes to the surface at things like the Hindu festival in October, but is going on throughout the year. And the number of tamnak, or I suppose what you call them, like a kind of medium's den, they are found in most communities across the city. There are hundreds and hundreds of them in Bangkok alone. And it is really a huge subculture that's quite often tied in with Thai tattoos that are done by people like the man on the left there, who's putting the mask over somebody who's being under trance. He's a tattoo master. And I would say a large majority of the Thai men in Bangkok have got these tattoos that are done in Tamnak, like that place where that master is entrancing somebody. Now, a lot of the mediums in Bangkok come from the gay or transgender community. The city's often been seen from outside as being unusually tolerant of seemingly an unusually numerous number of Gatoi or trans people, and this has become it's been heavily linked with the sensational side of Bangkok's past. But there's an awful lot of Bangkok people looking into the real lives of the people in the city lately, and Museum Siam has done a lot of exhibitions in this kind of field. They did one relating to gender that had a very interesting interactive aspect at the end, where they invited people to draw their own gender identity. And as you can see from these respondents here, there were some very surprising results. Not everybody seems to be completely happy in their gender role in Bangkok, it seems. Now, one of the dominant things about Bangkok is its sense of fun, or Sanuk. This is, it's not merely a good-natured city. It's a place where people actively pursue a sense of hilarity and cuteness and putting on a happy face in a very animated way, and turning pretty much any event into some kind of fun spectacle. And this can even be political events that are otherwise very traumatic, but go there on any other occasion and you find that they're full of fun. On the right here, there's this little boy with the hammer. He's even about to hit this device called a Factory of Happiness. Perhaps that's another slogan that Bangkok could have in the future. Now, with all this sensory stimulation, there is also an impulse to get away from all of that stimulation. I think part of the appeal of all the 7-Eleven and other community corner shops in Bangkok is that they provide a very anodyne, cool, air-conditioned, non-oppressive kind of surroundings. That their very plainness and neutrality is part of their appeal. And then you come out again and you're in the humid, chaotic outside. The same goes for malls. But one thing that's very distinct about Bangkok malls is that they are delineated very much by cultural features in the city. But one of the most dramatic is the use of gold shopping trolleys and gold shopping baskets in the Emporium Mall, which is an extremely upscale one. But pretty much every mall in Bangkok appeals to a particular demographic. They're not the same thing at all. Now, when you go into a mall, you encounter sensors. I made a point of looking at the rise of digital sensing within Bangkok, which is imposing itself very strongly. It's not just about these beeping gates that we've had for the last 10 years for security, but nowadays, of course, we've got temperature thermometers confronting people when they go into all kinds of buildings. This graphic at the bottom of this slide is actually the electromagnetic pollution in the city. A German woman devised a headphone set that you could walk around the city and the electromagnetic fields would be turned into sound. And when you walk around the city, it's quite startling to find how dramatic this is. And she said that Bangkok has a very particular electromagnetic trace that's very distinct from other cities, particularly by the sheer amount of and strength of the electromagnetic pollution. Every single kind of thing that has got an electric current in it is having an effect. Now, one of the cutest things about this shift towards a digital economy is the logo of the new Ministry of Digital Economy and Society, where the god, they've adapted the design of that god figure so that his finger now turns into a Wi-Fi signal. Now, one of the things I've tried to do with this book that's been a bit different from other views of Bangkok is to look at how technology enables us to see the city in other ways. So from satellites, we can see the land use and where people are living. And also we see the way that the rice fields there are clues to the reason why so many Bangkok roads are shaped as they are, which is based on old rice field divisions. This graphic went viral about 6 months ago because it showed that by 2050, the area in red would be underwater at high tide. And what's fascinating about this is that is pretty much the shape of the coastline about 1,500 years ago, when Thailand's oldest cities were all in a ring around Bangkok. They were basically ports in the past, and all the land of Ayutthaya and Bangkok and Samut Prakan and so on is all very, very recent geologically. And it may be that in the future, those will be coastal cities again. We can now see in this incredible website view that is live. It's got live data going into it from all over the world. We can see where people live. And this shows the distribution of population around Bangkok. And as we can see, it's not so much a sharp point like you get in other cities in the distance, but it's an enormous mound of a very high density over a huge area. And when it comes down to the smallest areas of Bangkok, there are devices using data which can enable us to see things that we don't normally see on maps of the city. This thing called depth map can reveal little details that are never on maps of which would normally have major buildings like shopping malls, but we can use this map to see where the knots of stalls and markets and things where people gather, even where they gather at certain times of day and not at other times of day. You can take this map and see the hidden informal city. And in fact, there's a completely separate grid of activity that goes on, both with transport that's never marked on maps and with shopping places that are never marked on maps, that are servicing the majority of the population. We can also see where people take their Instagram photographs. The ones that are in blue are Bangkok people, Bangkok phone numbers, and the ones in warm colors are from abroad. So we can see the tourist areas, but then we can also see the areas that are interesting Bangkok locals. So you can even work out the perimeter of Kasetsart Sart University up there. So dramatic are the number of pictures taken around there. And I quite like this one. This is from an art exhibition where people were invited to connect areas that mean something to them. There's each district of the city there. And so people coming into this exhibition are making their own lines of connection. Because one of the things that's the strongest sense in Bangkok is the sense of community. Now, this goes back to the old culture of Baworn, which is a word taken from the first letters of Ban, meaning house, or Wat, meaning temple, and Rongrian, meaning school. And the interconnection of those institutions and how they interacted was the foundation of community. But that is all starting to fall apart. Very close to where that previous scene was is this community called The Rich. I don't think any of them meet each other outside of their houses or outside of their limousines. But the idea of gated communities is really changing how Bangkok's fabric is. And there on the left, we can see what's been happening in the canal area of Bangui, where housing estates are being built that completely carve up the old canal structure of the city. So the city's really shaping itself into new ways all the time, which leads people to consider the memory that's left of certain places that disappear. In this picture are buildings that were the oldest urban forms in Bangkok that remained in the Bom Mahagan community behind one of the old forts. And these go back to the mid-19th century, and there were several buildings that were in very good condition, and they were deliberately destroyed. And that area is now just an empty park. So the experience of that destruction and many other destructions has led to a backlash of people, communities, young urbanists, all kinds of landscape architects and so forth, getting together to try and preserve communities intact. This one is Kudijin on the Tombri side of the river. So we now are getting to the end of the talk, where we have to consider the city as a whole and how transformed it has been from a bend in the river to a vast metropolis, one of the world's great urban concentrations, which some people map going all the way down to both sides of the Gulf of Thailand. It's an area almost as big as the Pearl Delta in China. That's of constant urban development. And so there's a question really about what Bangkok people feel about all of this. How do they see themselves as people whose idea of home is always in another province, that they go home at festival time to another part of the country, or whether the city is really their identity now? And this is an interesting question. And I've asked a lot of Thais about this who live in Bangkok, and I get many different answers. There was one guy who came from a community in Bangkok. He said, I'd only never noticed who the Bangkok people were at festival time when everyone else went home to another province. So he made him think, well, are the Bangkok people those who don't have another province to go to? That's quite a negative sense of identity of the city. But many people do have a sense of complaining about the city all the time. The bottom right image there is this is from an event for the founding of the Bangkok Cultural District, where they asked young artists to present their view of Bangkok. And it was striking because majority of them were quite negative. And I didn't expect this. There was a few that were very sentimental, or ones that just put out the usual cliches. But this particular one was showing all the kind of social problems in the city. Meanwhile, on the left, we have a kind of internationalist view. Ich bin ein Bangkokian. This is from a shop selling souvenirs of Bangkok that's finding it difficult to present a sense of Bangkok as for what it is, but putting it in international terms. But we're also seeing an increasing sense of Bangkok being people who live there loving its modernity and not finding it all a source of difficulty, but also a sense of possibility, with all the kinds of new connections like the SkyTrain that's seen in this Love Heart in Terminal 21. So on that note, I will finish speaking and go over to group talk. If you've got any questions or observations, maybe you want to talk about your own feelings about Bangkok and how you interpret it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. That was very good. Anyone's got any immediate questions they want to raise?
We need to unmute.
Please go ahead.
I want to go back. When can I go back? The rules are so complicated. No one can understand them. And why do we have to quarantine? It's all so sad. Well, I can understand going from the UK, actually, why everyone would want to quarantine us across the entire world. But thank you very much, Philip. I'm the publisher, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know that. And Philip and I have been friends for how long now? 20 years or something?
Oh, it's about that, yes.
Actually, he's starting another book, because Philip says, famously says, oh, I did this other book, but actually it took 10 years.
Made it in the air.
And so when he says I'm doing another book, which I think is a great idea on Chinatown, or the sort of Chinese influence in Bangkok, we're looking at it in a very different way from a sort of very academic history. I think, gosh, how long is that going to be? Will I be spared? Will I still be around?
Well, actually, the fortunate thing with that is there's material left over from very left over from very Bangkok. So we have a starting point.
Is that already underway?
Well, in a kind of planning way, and I do have material to start from. Yes.
No, I think that'll be a very interesting. Both your books so far have been very interesting. I was just struck by. Have you seen this concept applied to other countries? Have you seen this applied to, let's say, very Malaysia, very KL? Have you seen similar sort of?
Well, the books about cities are a big thing nowadays. There's an awful lot of people whose work and livelihoods are based around understanding cities. People really need to understand how they work, and there's a lot of looking around for what are the good role models, what systems could people copy or borrow ideas from. And in that view, a lot of people don't look at Bangkok as being a role model for how to run a city. But it's quite interesting. There are other people, though, that view Bangkok as particularly resilient, Teflon Thailand, and that whatever you throw at Bangkok, it seems to somehow survive it. And it might not be very pretty, but there's a urbanist concept these days called messy urbanism, and a lot of these cities are Asian megalopolises with huge amounts of migrants and refugees and slums and informal systems, and that view is trying to make these work a bit better than they do now, but to accept that actually these systems often work better than very rigid but brittle structures that we put in our modern cities. And one of the features of Bangkok has been its informal culture and the way that it's been able to absorb huge crises and be very inventive. It's not so much of a inventing culture, but in an original way, but it's adaptive. So as we face global warming and pandemics, Bangkok proves to be very adaptive. There was an amazing thing I saw recently of a shopping mall in Bangkok had adapted its lift so that all of the floors and calling the lift were all done with foot pedals. It's ingenious. I don't know what happens in a tower block where you've got 50 foot pedals, but
A lot of parts.
You hire an organist.
it's a solution to the problem of people pressing buttons and communicating the disease.
But surely one of the big benefits of having a lift is it's accessible for people in wheelchairs or people that can't use their legs. So it kind of defeats the point there.
Well, maybe they can have a stick.
True.
The Bangkok, designed foot pedal stick adaptation device.
Yeah, cool.
Philip, sorry, did anybody, it was really interesting, but between touch and heat and humidity, I only heard you, I didn't have any slides. Did anyone have this problem?
You didn't see any slides at all?
Between touch, when you got to touch,
Yes.
and heat and humidity, I lost that whole section because I was looking at it, so I could hear you, Philip, but I couldn't, there were no slides. It just froze and then it came back.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, they were to do with sound, and do you want to look at those slides?
I heard you, but I didn't.
You didn't see the slides.
I can, if you want, I can briefly. If you keep people, don't mute them, but I can show those slides if you want to.
Well, isn't this being recorded, and we can actually look at it at another time?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay, we can do that. Oh. Brilliant. Brilliant.
These are the slides.
It is being recorded, yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we can still talk while scrolling through them. These are the color swatches. In fact, you can even buy those paints and paint your house according to those paints. And then we get to the color gray.
Okay. Right. Okay. I lost it we're back now. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. I'm curious as to getting feedback on this kind of thing, whether the idea of looking at the city through senses appeals to people, whether it strikes a chord, or whether it's baffling, or what was your feelings about that?
I think it's really relatable, and it puts everything into a context that everyone, or the majority of people that have all five senses, are able to relate to. And yeah, so much of what you said rings very true. Like when I thought it was really clever when you identified that 7-Elevens have that kind of desensitizing power. I used to live in Hoi Kwang, and I used to sometimes go down to the MRT, where it was the only place where there was just vast amounts of space with nothing there down in the MRT. And there was no people. It was air conditioned. There was some kind of nice classical music playing, and it was just quiet and spacious and cool and very plain. And I think, yeah, that when I think back to it, was always quite a calming influence to be in the MRT underground station. and have that kind of respite from the kind of overwhelming senses that are all kind of alive when you're up in the street level.
Well, going around, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was saying, so that space hasn't got filled. It's an open space.
Well, you know, Ma Boon Krong, that notorious mall in the middle of Bangkok, that is the absolute epitome of tiny booths and little alleyways. When that opened, that was huge marble concourses and open spaces. So the malls themselves keep getting filled with booths, and even the glossy malls, they're now putting ever more little enclosures with high tea and car displays and things like this into the middle of the malls. It's like the city doesn't tolerate having large spaces. It must be something psychological. I do look into that in the book, actually. What is the psychology that's perhaps going on there?
Yes, and can I say that the book is available? You can see Phil's got a whole stack of them. So you can order them online or order them from me or Chris. So, you know, do feel free to buy a book.
With the recording on the website, there should be just include how the books can be ordered. I think that would be very, very, very useful, particularly for people who haven't sort of listened to this. They can watch the recording, and then if they want to get hold of a copy of the book, they know how to do it. I think that would be very useful.
Absolutely. Narissa can supply the information for that, because it can be mailed out to people when people
exactly
the same ways as usual. It is available through the other online ways, but through Narissa is the most direct and simplest.
So I think that would be good.
Philip, I have a question. Another question.
Sure.
My first question, let's just get this out of the way first. What bar serves the lab moo cocktail? Because lab moo is my favourite Thai dish, and I would love to try that. So, where is that?
Eat Me.
Oh, I've been to Eat Me. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So that's been there for well over 20 years.
I didn't see that. I obviously wasn't looking at the cocktail menu hard enough.
When I go there, I tend to get a free drink, because I was the first person that ever reviewed that restaurant back in the days of Bangkok Metro magazine.
Well, next time I'm there, I'll mention your name. And maybe I'll get there.
They have a whole range of food cocktails. There's about half a dozen of them.
Okay.
But the lab moo is amazing. You know when you do a margarita and you use I think it's lime juice around the rim of the glass, and then you turn it upside down into salt.
Yeah.
What they've done there, they put lime juice, which is of course very, very Thai, around the rim, and then they attach that little area that looked like a tongue.
Yes.
They dipped that into the toasted rice that you get in Chiang Mai Lab.
Yeah.
So
very clever.
You've got that toasted rice taste, and then this very peculiar thing when you tilt the drink towards your mouth, and you've got this incredible lab move, the herbal flavor. You then are inhaling from this sheet of bacon.
And I really like I like savoury cocktails. I don't like anything sweet or fruity, but I went to the Ginger House in Chiang Mai, and I had a Tom Yum cocktail. And then recently, my last time I was there, I tried a truffle and parmesan cocktail.
Wow.
And that was, like you said, kind of the rim was coated in very, very finely grated parmesan, which is strange. Very strange, but bizarrely, it worked. So
there are some astounding cocktails in Bangkok. It's gone from being a place where you could hardly ever get any cocktails of any quality, just like with no coffee of any quality, to being a place where you can get the most amazing coffees and cocktails. There's one coffee bar that specializes in honey cocktails, and all of the honey is wild honey. It's extraordinary. It's called
Which one's that one?
It's called Asia Today.
Okay.
And it's run by that guy,
the
Nix Anuman Ratchathon, who opened Teens of Thailand and got prosecuted for he was delivering cocktails to people in shutdown, and the government was going against him because of alcohol, you know.
Yeah.
I do like this culture of like the themed things they do. I think that's quite, is that taken, do you think, from kind of the Japanese and Korean themed bars? Like they have, you know, the cat cafes and the owl cafes and these things.
Well, I think some of that
are popping up.
is in there, but honestly, Bangkok in particular is so faddish. It constantly needs a new rejuvenation of fads. It seems to be a very short attention span. And my personal view is that because there's such a cultural taboo against criticizing and challenging established things, that then there's a culture not of invention, but of adaptation. And because it's so much more difficult to adapt to tradition, although they do morph over time, but it's easier to satisfy that need for novelty by importing fads all the time. So this happens with so many things. It's the churn of fads coming through the culture is so dramatic that I think it's to do with that you can't innovate with established Thai things without getting a lot of opposition. But you can adapt foreign things easily.
Philip, can we thank you very much for your talk? We found it very interesting.
Yes.
We were in Bangkok a long time ago now, so it's nice to be brought a little bit up to date.
Indeed, absolutely.
When were you there?
Thank you, yes, and thank you to
87 we went.
Oh,
and thank you to Andrew and to Steve and everybody for
Everybody.
being
Marissa,
there.
thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
All right.
Thank you
But
very
we'll
much.
escape now.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Just before you go, Andrew, just to say thank you very much for joining us. I think this has been a very good starting point for these series of talks, and it was good to have the test section yesterday to sort of iron a few things out. But by and large, I think it worked very well today, and
Yes.
it's a very good format. We must try and find out why some of the others weren't able to join us, if it was for technical reasons or for whatever reasons. But I think this is particularly in the current circumstances, this is a very good way of continuing to have some events and catching up with each other, because
Absolutely.
besides that, it's just going to be a huge drought.
We look forward to the next one.